Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this Bright Blue event in partnership with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So my name is Sam. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Bright Blue, and in case you don't know us, we are an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism, and our major aim, I suppose, in our research and policy programme is to defend and improve liberal society. So if you're joining us online or want to contribute to the debate in here, then please tweet using the hashtag BrightBlue and hashtag CBC22, and also do give us a follow. We're on @WeAreBrightBlue. So I'm joined by an illustrious panel of speakers. It's quite a full house, as you can see on the desk. So to my immediate right is Damian Collins. Damian is the Minister for Tech and Digital Economy, so, yep. And was chair of the DCMS committee from 2016 to 2019. And just one step along, also joined by Susie Buckridge. She's the General Manager of Product Strategy and Delivery at TalkTalk. And then a further step along, we have Daniel Korski, who is the CEO and co-founder of Public. So, and moving to the left, just on my far left, we have Jasper Jackson. Jasper is the technology editor at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. He was previously assistant editor at The Guardian and digital editor at The New Statesman. And then one step next to Jasper, we have James Plunkett. James is the executive director for advice and advocacy at Citizens Advice. He's also authored a book, End State, 9 Ways Society is Broken and How We Can Fix It. And finally, on my immediate left, we have Rachel Coldicutt. Rachel is the director of Careful Industries and was also founder of Doteveryone. So just in this panel, we'll have speakers speaking for 5 minutes before we move to Q&As. But briefly, we'll be talking about a bit about what the biggest benefits and challenges from technological innovation have been since the start of the millennium, kind of how the digital world is changing our behaviour and our politics. How technology is changing campaigning and power, and really just so we have some solutions as well. What role public policy and regulation can play in improving the public benefit from the tech sector. Obviously, if you're joining us online, you can also ask questions through the Slido link located. That will just be located next to or below the video player. So just to get the ball rolling, I'll come to you, Damian.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Just to let you know, later on, I have to leave at about 3:20. So if I get up and walk out at that point, it's not a reaction to anything anyone has said or done. It's just sadly I've got another fringe I have to go and speak at as well. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you as a Minister for Tech and the Digital Economy, and many people know I've sort of been working in this space on the Select Committee and other areas for a while, so it's great to have the chance to look at these issues of digital strategy in government. And the topic sort of in a way is phenomenally wide. I mean, it couldn't be wider, because you can't really talk about technology being a sort of discrete area of the economy or discrete part of the government. It is embedded in everything. We were having a conversation around how we develop tech clusters and drive growth in tech businesses, and there's a danger. You sometimes think, well, a tech business is a company that is working designing products and services exclusively for the tech sector, or developing AI products, but most businesses have people working within them now that would be considered to be fairly sophisticated tech professionals. I look at a business like Saga in my constituency, which most people think of when they hear that name of cruise holidays for the over 50s, but that's a tiny part of their business. Their business is really they're a financial product provider and insurer for a huge number of people, and at the heart of it is incredibly sophisticated tech operations. So So I think we have to see it as being part of everything, and the development of it is not just about concentrating on a small number of businesses in a small number of places, but looking at how the whole tech economy develops, how tech develops through the whole economy as well. I think that brings with it also some other challenges, and I would say, if you like, we've got, I'd say, 3 issues I would say we should look at when we think about, what is the government's tech strategy. So the first one is growth. Like probably most countries in the world would identify the digital sector as an important part of the growing economy, because it's in and of itself is growing. The great thing about digital trade is that distance doesn't matter, in quite the same way. We have great expertise, great clusters in this country, and therefore, how do we charge that? What can the government do to attract more investment into tech sectors, to support innovations, particularly in AI, and the benefits to business that can come from that, but also the benefits that can come from improving the delivery of public services as well. So how do we support the growth of that sector? The second thing is then competition. We are looking at competition regulation because we would say that the new economy creates new challenges as well. We want to make sure the principles of having not just free markets but fair markets apply in the digital world as well, that we don't see the over-dominance of some companies who become almost monopoly providers of certain services, which can have a detriment to consumers and higher costs, but also to smaller businesses that are challengers, that find it difficult to find space to compete. If we want to see more bigger UK tech companies, we have to consider not just their access to finance, but also their ability to compete in a fair market. And then the final area is obviously safety, and this, with the online safety bill is a key function as well. When I was first elected to Parliament, when Daniel was in number 10, it was kind of it was a simpler time, in a way. You'd have been sitting here with your Blackberries, so you'd have had phone and email. You may have taken a couple of pictures. You might have had Twitter and Facebook accounts, but you'd probably be uploading to that. Back in your hotel rooms, not sitting in this room doing it on an app-based smart device. And so the challenges were very different about connectivity here has been established. The devices have got smarter, but from a safety point of view, what has really changed is the power of recommendation, I think, and that's when we talk about the online safety bill, the principal thing that we're looking at is, I would say, the question of whether it is harmful content recommended and actually promoted to people that are vulnerable, particularly children, but adults who can be vulnerable as well. And what liability do platforms have for facilitating that activity? And if you look at the question of, say, news or politics, how the power of recommendation is changing those, it is by creating new clusters of tribes of people that may be largely only engaged with content that they agree with, and with people that they agree with, and they see the world through that lens. And you might say, well, is that really a problem? Well, it can be. And it could lead to a politics which is more fractured, and more divided, and in a world where increasingly many people would regard their primary source of news as being social media as well, where they're seeing a feed curated for them, not something that represents a balance of opinion, and that is definitely changing the news industry and politics as well. I would just say a final point on connectivity. We're obviously, the government is trying to accelerate the rollout of 5G to support the incredible demand of services. I think actually, going back 12 years, few people would have accurately have predicted the amount of data people consume every day, the extent to which we would need to create an infrastructure that would support upload and download requirements that were far beyond what we thought would be necessary. So that connectivity is great, but I think of Britain, in the world, a third of the world is not connected at all. 60% of people who aren't connected are in Africa, compared to only 10% in Europe. And there is a global challenge as well, which I think UK can play a role in actually connecting the entire world, not just seeing the advance for the areas that are already benefiting from technology.
Thank you, Damian. A very succinct typology there of the policy challenges. I mean, just a quick one from me before we move on. I mean, in terms of some of the policy goals, do you see any potential tensions or trade-offs, for instance, between safety and competition?
So I don't think these trade-offs should be seen. I mean, we should take a view on safety as to say, do we think things that are illegal offline should be illegal online? And what liability do platforms have? So is the offence committed only by the person that posts something? But if that platform is recommending that content to someone else that thinks likes it, surely the platform has a responsibility as well. So I think it's about being really clear of saying, not trying to create a different sort of regulation for the tech sector, but to say, well, how do things that we already recognise as being illegal offline, how do they apply online and who is responsible? And so I think we should do that as looking at the safety standards themselves. And also, if a platform says it's going to do something in its terms of service and leads users to believe there's a certain sort of experience they can expect, but the company doesn't deliver on that, well, does the company have any responsibility to do it at all? So the safety standards really look at how you apply the law to platforms and how you make sure they abide by their terms of service. And competition is just a question of, I think, applying principles that exist already to an online environment. So for most people in this room who have a mobile device, smart device in their hand, will have access to one of two app stores, which are not interoperable and are both monopolies. And so the CMA has asked questions saying, well, do we think there's a consumer detriment to this? The CMA think it's costing consumers about £2 billion a year more than they might need to pay because of that. If you're a small business that has designed a brilliant product you're selling on Amazon, and then hypothetically, I'm not accusing Amazon of doing this. If hypothetically Amazon came along and said, we can rip that off, we can rank it higher, we'll de-rank that one so no one will ever find it, and we'll eat their business for them, or to do as Mark Zuckerberg did with Vine and just decide, well, we think this app is getting too much Facebook data, so we're going to just kick it off the platform. These are kind of like, these sorts of issues are the normal sorts of issues that are considered in competition legislation. But that legislation wasn't written thinking about these markets. So I think it's about making decisions about what's right and then applying that. And I think, I don't think that is to the detriment of these companies or the sector. I think actually, largely on safety stuff, all we're looking to do is create safety standards that the company should already be fulfilling in their own terms of service. And in competition, I think the competition policy should be there to benefit the whole of the tech economy, not just a couple of big players.
Great, thanks Damian. Susie.
Hi, Susie Buckridge, and a pleasure to be here too, to talk to something I'm very passionate about. My role at TalkTalk is to be in charge of products, so developing all of our products, whether that be from fibre through to TV. And before that, I was CEO of a software company, so quite a good background on how technology really can transform lives. So a bit about TalkTalk. We are the country's largest affordable broadband and connectivity provider. We're based up in Salford in Manchester. And we've been around for about 20 years, and in that time we've been looking to really shake up the products that are on offer to make sure that they are the most affordable and accessible products that are out there. And today we offer a really, really wide range. And in those 20 years, I think, as Damian just really referenced, we've seen an unprecedented change. I mean, the transformation in the data that is required to go over our networks has been unbelievable. We've moved from offering dial-up services, as just touched on, to now really trying to work out how to kind of deal with the peaks that are coming over our networks, and that is really driven by, if we look at the average home in the UK now, there's between 9 and 10 connected devices, which is a transformative change in terms of the amount of content, the proliferation of that content, and that means that demand has gone up to such a degree that, to put it in context, April 22, the end of April this year, was the largest peak that we saw going over our networks. And that was driven by two things, which is streaming and gaming. And that night, two things converged, which was the semi-final of the Champions League on Amazon Prime, streaming over Prime, combined with a 40 megabit update on, I'm sure you're all very familiar with, Call of Duty Warzone that was coming down. And those two things together put a peak of 8.7 terabits per second over our network. And that is going up 40% year on year in terms of the network that's coming out. So this is really a huge change that we're seeing. But more broadly, all of that content is driving quite a few changes in the transformation that we're talking about here today. So the ones I would call out would be the business model changes that we're seeing. So my background is TV and TV software. And if we look at just how that content has moved online from kind of BBC iPlayer and then Netflix following it, Amazon then coming on with Prime and Bezos realising that if he can get some Golden Globes, he can sell more trainers, as he famously talked about. And then that moving to now we're seeing Disney and Paramount, big players who are now moving online and changing how they're putting out content. No longer just in cinema, we'll put it first out online. I mean, these are, really, really huge changes that we're seeing in our industry. And for business, we're also seeing, of course, the advent of cloud technology and robotics, which is having a huge impact on how we're changing how we can operate and do so more effectively. And then in terms of, just society, in terms of social benefits of online, we've seen that, and obviously through the pandemic, the benefits that come from that, as well as the societal impacts. And as we go forward, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more today, the impacts of healthcare and how we can put some of those out over the network and how that can really transform people's lives. And I'm also just very passionate about how technology can transform the planet and how now we can understand more about the data we're putting over our networks and use our insights from the technology to drive real changes in terms of CO2 emissions across the country and the businesses and also what we do at home and the role in that. So overall, I'm an optimist of how technology can change lives, but also not naive. There are some big challenges that are presented. And I think, facing into those, as we do at TalkTalk every day, is how do we make sure this transformation is fair? How do we make sure that this transformation is not creating more of a digital divide? So we've got the difference between the tech savvy and those who are reticent. And how do we make sure that the products we're putting out there are addressing both of those need states? And finally, of course, we know the potential harms that are out there. And I think really understanding who is responsible for dealing with that as we go forth will be critical to the success and making sure that we do this in the right way. So overall, an optimist, but not naive.
Fantastic. Well, we'll have to see if there's any pessimism on the panel, if there's any notes of
Can't
disagreement. Daniel.
Right. Sorry for being late, first of all. They've already tweeted out the picture of the panel without me, so I quickly had to I am here, I swear. You won't be surprised, given my background, that I want to talk about the role that technology has played and can play in order to transform and improve public services. And it might seem like, for a relatively young audience, a kind of trite thing to say. I mean, all of you are used to updating your driver's licenses online or using a parking app in order to park your car. Haven't really seen the best that technology can afford. And the truth is, of course, we've come a long way. I mean, thinking back to when Damian and I were first working together so many years ago, a lot of these things did not exist, or they were existing in a very rudimentary form. But the truth is, we're still only just scratching the surface of what technology can do to facilitate the delivery of great public services. It was only 2 weeks ago that an AI-enabled program was able to scan just slices of images of a brain in order to detect Parkinson at a juncture much earlier than anybody else has been able to do with the naked eye, with the use of lots of expert support. A week and a half ago, the Portuguese government was able to gather data from a range of different data sources, both that the government held themselves, but also held by energy companies, NGOs and so forth, in order to identify those customers who would be particularly disadvantaged in the context of the energy crisis. And we're able to proactively offer support to them, by the way, in a manner that the UK government is still incapable of doing for a whole range of reasons. And finally, it was only 5 weeks ago that the boroughs in London got together in order to decide that actually all the guidance that needs to be issued to individual boroughs for how they procure government, digital services for government ought to maybe sort of be streamlined and put up in a simple template way and made easier for companies to engage with. So we're just still, scratching the surface of what technology can do in order to transform public services. And you might say, well, that's all fine and well, but why does that merit a conversation, at this august table? Yes, it's about the efficiency that can be derived, but I'll come to that later. But I think there's something much bigger and more important at work here, right? Because at a time when there's real, I think, distrust in politics, and a sense that our society is becoming increasingly unequal, that people aren't getting a fair deal for what they pay in, whether that's through their taxes or their labor or their work or their commitment. It becomes, in my view, increasingly important that the services that the state and the community around it supports are as best as they can possibly be. And so to me, this is not just a question of, are we saving money, are we creating a more efficient operation? This is about something much more important and to the heart of things that ought to be discussed at events like this, which is how do we create a fair and functioning and equitable society. So how do we reap the benefits of all these potential transformations that are going on? A couple of things. You asked for some admonitions. Well, first of all, leadership matters. And I'm really pleased that Damian is here. You said he was the past and the present minister, and I jokingly said in the panel, and the future, because I think governments come and go, but Damian Collins is going to remain, hopefully, the digital minister. But I would say that we have, over the last couple of years, lacked a kind of real sense of leadership around the agenda of technology and government. Not how we support the technology sector, which is your area of responsibility, but how government thinks about technology, what it wants to do with it. Now, on the one hand, the revolution has spread. It doesn't need to be led from the center in the same way that it needed to be done a couple of years ago. Departments are charging ahead and so forth. But there just has been a lack of leadership, and I think we're coming up to some very thorny issues and complex choices. And without leadership, that's incredibly difficult to deal with, both political and bureaucratic. So leadership matters. But the other thing that matters is values. And this goes a little bit to this efficiency question I was alluding to. You know, great technology can do amazing things for public services, but it's not just about efficiency. Public services mean so much more to people than just the delivery of a certain thing. It's about how they connect to the community around them, how they are valued. If you just think about it in a very simple way, you know, how somebody, a disadvantaged family, is treated and dealt with by social services can be enormously impactful for, you know, their lives, their life choices. And similarly, if many of those transactions are digitized or technology enables some of those transactions, then those transactions too will have an enormous impact. So we've got to think, values matter. You know, what are the values at the core of how we deliver public services beyond we want to make them more efficient? So I think that's a sort of an area I don't think we've talked enough about. So leadership matters, but I also think values matter in taking advantage of what technology can do for public services. The third point I wanted to make is allied to this, which is there's a tendency, particularly in constrained economic times, to say, can we get rid of some people and hire some and bring some technology in? But the irony is that to get really great technology actually takes a lot of empathy and time and reflection to ensure that the technology that's available, you know, solves the actual problem rather than an imagined problem. And so often you have a little bit of a period, and most people who've built technology companies, you know, Susie and Rachel, you'll know this, know that it takes time. You've got to conduct the user research, you've got to reflect, you've got to iterate your product. And I think government sometimes forgets that, and it's like, okay, well, there's some technology we can bring in here, can we get rid of some people? Fantastic. Whereas actually, you might have to hire some more people in an immediate short term in order to come to a real, you know, granular understanding of the problem, and then over time, there can be an efficiency saving. So that's just something we're thinking about. And my final 2 points is, you know, you need a functioning market. And unfortunately, I don't think we've been reflective enough about the kind of market that we want. What I mean is the market of technology providers who are selling into public services. Tony Blair famously had a conversation with one of, I know, are we allowed to quote Tony Blair? Conservative Party conference any longer? I can't quite decide. The frisson of excitement in the room as I did. Tony Blair apparently had a conversation with one of his ministers, and he said, not in a particularly sort of digitized context, but he said, we've got to rely on the market. And everybody was very quiet, and somebody said, but there is no market here. And the truth is, in many cases, there isn't yet a functioning market of technology providers to rely on. And we see that particularly in the NHS, where there are sort of duopolistic providers that are owning 80% of digital provision. That's not really a market. We need a really thriving market where new players can challenge existing models. And so that's hugely, hugely important. And the final point I wanted to touch on, and Susie, I'm so pleased that you mentioned it, which is this digital divide. A couple of months ago, I launched an initiative called Unlock Digital. Please look it up if you haven't seen it. It's an effort at trying to, in London, bridge this divide. Because during COVID, we as a society, the state, did quite a lot to reach out to disadvantaged communities. I remember sitting with my son as I'm sure many of you sat with your children, trying to get them through schooling, only to realize when the tiles came up to show some of the other kids, some of them were sitting on the floor with just one phone and no table, with a parent trying to figure out how to access some of the technology. Thankfully, the government did quite a lot, but the problem hasn't been solved. And unfortunately, there is a massive digital divide. I did a study before the launch of Unlock Digital, and we found that more than half of all jobs in London now require some form of advanced digital skills. So that doesn't just mean if you go and work in the technology sector, it's anything. And that's going to grow and grow and grow. It already grew by 20% from before the crisis. It'll just grow and grow and grow. And so if you don't have access to devices, if you don't have an understanding, you're not even going to get a job. And we're not talking about a job in the technology sector. And in that kind of context, digitizing public services is all well and good, but if you're not reaching people, you might end up creating greater problems than you're trying to solve. So great opportunities, but requires leadership, the right values.
Striking another very optimistic but realistic note there. So we'll come next to Jasper.
I'm the technology editor of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. We're a non-profit newsroom. We work with media around the world, publishing with them investigations. And I run a project called Big Tech. One of the things I've found interesting about this is obviously we're talking about technology, but what we're actually talking about is the internet specifically. None of the sort of major technological innovations pretty much are not almost entirely about the internet, or at least built off them and based on them. And I've heard historians sort of over the last couple of years sort of joke that basically you think the internet is causing a lot of upheaval, but you haven't seen anything compared to the invention of the printing press. And obviously they're right. We haven't had sort of hundreds of years of wars since. But I think the thing they really overlook is actually that we're very much at the beginning of the internet era. The internet itself was only invented about 40 years ago, the World Wide Web another 20 years ago, social media about a decade ago. We're going to get a lot more upheaval. And I realise everyone's been very optimistic. I, as the journalist in the room, am going to be a bit more pessimistic because that's my day job. And I look at sort of the problems the internet is creating. And there are a couple, I think, that are sort of illustrative of the challenges we're facing and also the failures to deal with them that the internet is causing. So one of the things we've been looking at the Bureau is misinformation. The internet was meant to democratise access to information. Everyone gets access to Wikipedia. It bypasses gatekeepers like me and the media, and in theory should lead to a much sort of fairer world because everyone has access to that information. What's become incredibly clear over the last decade or so is that we are completely unprepared for this world. Individuals are completely unprepared for dealing with this environment, and the institutions we have are completely unprepared to help people adapt through these things. And you've got really great examples, terrible examples. Recently, during the pandemic, you had vaccine misinformation that reduced uptake. You had people believing conspiracy theories and thus not complying with regulations designed to save lives. Currently, if you look at Ukraine and Russia, there's a huge amount of disinformation pushed out by the Russian government, deliberately designed to muddy the waters, challenge support for Ukraine, and justify its actions. And if you look at pretty much any election currently going on or in the future, we've probably got one in a couple of years, maybe sooner, there will be huge concerted attempts to undermine those through manipulation of information. It's just a feature of our democratic system now. And these are huge problems that, frankly, regulators and the tech companies themselves are lagging far behind in terms of trying to deal with. One of the other things the Bureau has been looking at is a slightly different issue, which is basically how the internet is sort of outsourcing on steroids when it comes to labour. We've seen jobs shifting to other countries because they can be done remotely through the internet, etc. But we're also seeing additional layers on top of this where you have someone in India doing a job of labelling data images coming out of a warehouse somewhere in America. And these people are extremely badly paid. They're doing very stressful jobs. And the jobs they're doing are actually designed to train AI to eliminate jobs the other side of the world. This creates huge problems, not just in terms of undermining labour markets in the West and the poor conditions, but also the challenges of dealing with these are intrinsically transnational. And again, we're really not set up to deal with these problems at all. And that's going to have a huge effect on the labour economy over the next few years. And I think we're very much at the start of this, but governments have been really, really slow. The UK's done better than a lot of places, but it's still lagging far behind a lot of these changes, and we're only really getting started. And I think if governments don't really step up, we're going to see many more different issues coming out of the internet and coming out of technology that will pose huge, huge challenges for society, and we're really not ready to deal with them at all.
Thank you. There's some contrast at last. Right. So next up, we'll come to James, our penultimate speech.
Thanks. So bumper panel, so lots of points made already, but I will bring in some history to the debate. I think it can be useful to contextualise conversations like this in a very long-run history of tech. I'll start with this sort of slightly counterintuitive one, which is that this is not really about technology. But by which I mean it's easy to get a bit distracted by the sort of excitement of individual technologies in conversations like this. When you look at history, the thing that is really very profound about a moment like this is not so much the technologies as the business models that they enable and the new ways of working and living that those technologies make possible. And people have touched on some of those already in the discussion. But fundamentally what happens at a moment like this, I believe, is that you have very profound changes in the way in which our economy and society functions. In my book, I talk about this as a new practice of production that is emerging. And there's an obvious analogy with the Industrial Revolution and the changes that played out then. So new ways of generating value in the private sector, new ways of working, new ways of running organisations and governments, as we're discussing today. That's an incredibly profound shift historically, and obviously we know quite a lot about the ways in which changes like that play out from the history of technology, particularly in the 19th century. I think that's a really interesting history to learn from. The very significant kind of lesson, I guess, from the Industrial Revolution, which is relevant to discussions like the one we're having today, is that you ultimately need a new way of governing as the economy changes in those kinds of ways. And it's very notable when you look at the kind of form of government, if you like, that emerged at the end of the 19th century. It was unrecognisably different from the form of government that we had at the start of the 19th century. And we built, in essence, a new kind of state in a really significant way in that period. And in essence, the state that we built is the social democratic settlement, which emerged in the sort of late 19th century and into the early 20th century. And that, in essence, was the way in which we came to govern, if you like, industrial capitalism, or the kind of the form of capitalism that held in that period of history. And we're now transitioning into what in my book I call digital capitalism. You can give it different names if you like, but essentially into a different period of technological history. I think that can be quite useful context, because if you want to understand sort of where we're at today and why things feel, if you like, quite messy, this sort of sense that things are spinning out of our control, politically, economically, and in many other ways, it's because I think at what is a very early stage in a new revolution, I agree with Jasper, we're in the very early days of this thing, you get a period in which, if you like, the private sector economy sort of leaves government behind, and a lot of these new applications that have emerged in the tech sector and in other parts of the private sector economy, government hasn't yet really caught up with, hasn't yet applied within government, and also hasn't worked out how to regulate and how to respond to these new business models and new behaviours and practices. And so there's this sense of a sort of widening gap of the private sector economy pulling ahead and working in some very fundamentally different and new ways, and the state sort of scrabbling around trying to work out how do you regulate this fundamentally novel kind of economy. We've touched briefly on some of the kind of examples. Again, I think it's really interesting and quite educational to look back on the mid-19th century when quite a similar dynamic played out, and it's fascinating. If you read letters and sort of diary entries and newspaper articles from the mid-19th century, there's a real sense of familiarity with the kind of vibe that we've got now. So at that time in the 1850s, 1860s, there were this sense of sort of mounting new social problems. Child labour was obviously a huge concern at the time. Sewage was literally kind of piling up on the streets of London because we hadn't yet worked out how to govern cities, which were one of the consequences of the changes at that time. A monopoly was a problem, not coincidentally, because often you get changes to competition in markets where new tech emerges. And it's really strange, as I say, if you read sort of letters to the newspapers at that time, you feel a real sense of sort of familiarity with these people and the sort of hair-tearing frustration that they felt at kind of why can't the government get a grip on some of these emerging social problems, which feels quite similar to now. Not a coincidence there was a populist movement that emerged in the late 19th century because people got so angry about government's failure to kind of grapple with some of these new challenges, much like some of the more populist movements we see today. So I think that's the kind of final takeaway, just to kind of finish up with, is that you can't respond to a set of changes like this with incrementalism. You can't just sort of tweak the existing policy levers that you've got. I say in my book, it's a slightly glib line, but we didn't respond to the Industrial Revolution by tweaking our medieval policy instruments. So, we didn't expand the guilds and sort of boost funding for the Knights of the Garter, or kind of cut the horse tax. There was a horse tax. We didn't cut the horse tax, we replaced the horse tax with income tax and VAT and other taxes. So you need sort of deeper reform that is more than incremental. I won't go into examples, but competition, completely agree. Competition policy is not fit for the economy that is now emerging, and we need a new way of thinking about it, and that's just one example. So I'm actually optimistic. I always end on a note of optimism. I'm very optimistic. We've been through changes like this before, and we got there in the end, but we need real boldness, and I would say more leadership and boldness than we kind of have had, I guess, in recent decades, if we're going to get through the next few decades.
Thank you, James, and sort of reinforcing there Daniel's point that we're going to need to really rethink some of the way we wire up society, as it were, to tackle some of these challenges. So finally, Rachel, if you want to give a few words.
I think it is going last. So I suppose I've got a slightly different point to make to lots of the other speakers, because it feels to me like the digital world we're living in now is not really representative of the world as a whole. It would be like if we lived in a shopping mall, right? It would be as if a Facebook owned everything, and that actually there's a real opportunity now to be opening up and investing in other things in society as a whole, to not only be thinking about the markets, but to be thinking about our whole digital lives. And it feels as if maybe a lot of the ways we're thinking about legislating at the moment are looking backwards at what's happened over the last decade. But really, we need to be looking ahead resolutely, not only at things that have happened, but what might happen and how we can make a world that isn't dependent on a tiny number of companies to make the norms that everybody lives in. And I have like a few specifics coming out of that are not maybe don't all seem to be connected, but actually I think this is like part of the thing about our digital lives, is they bring together lots of things that don't really make sense, right? It's not like a total analogue of day to day. We're hyper-connected, we're hyper-aware. And so I think the first thing is, like, what is happening outside of Silicon Valley? But equally, what's happening out of the startups? What's happening in the tech that is made in our communities, that is bringing the values of people to life? How can we invest in that and build it more? How can we think more about supporting the people who are running bakeries, food banks, community pubs? And I think they're the beating heart of like a different kind of internet that we don't acknowledge. I think the next thing is, like, we've talked about connectivity, but we've not really talked about what that means longer term, and we haven't talked about data and the importance of moving to a green infrastructure, that delivers the compute power we need for AI, that sets us up for whatever happens with 3, that means that we're not in a place where housing can't be built because of the sizes of the grid that data centres are taking on. And this is like a really urgent infrastructural thing that will lay the groundwork for many years. And the other point there about infrastructure, and to Dan's point about public services, is that actually, I think a lot of the time when we roll those public services out, we do it with the values of the market. We do it with the surveillance at its heart. And I think it's very, very important to remember that there are many people who are subject to the digital hostile environment who have no incentive to be online. You know, it's all very well to say that we're building infrastructure for everyone, but not if we're making life too hard. And I think doing that undermines delivering health care, payments. You know, it's really important to bear it in mind. And lastly, I would say, as we think about the world we're interested in making, like it's very easy to like regulate by making a list of everything we've seen happen that hasn't worked, right? But actually, we need a vision, right, that isn't only startups or the safety. It's about good lives for everyone. And that needs to be shared and owned. And I think it's very easy, relatively, to get excited about decacorns and enormous companies. But actually, what we need to get really excited about is good lives for everyone. And I think technology can enable that. We just have to make it happen.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So now we have about half an hour for some questions. And if you're joining us online, just a reminder that you can ask questions through the Slido link located next to or below the video player. And then for anyone in the room, if you could just wait for the roaming mic to reach you before asking your question, and then just giving your name and organisation, and yes, try and keep the questions brief. So we'll take them in rounds of 3. So if anyone on the floor has a question, yes, the lady in the blue dress.
Hi, Rose Marley, Cooperatives UK. I'm interested in the panel's view on the opportunity with social impacts for shared ownership of things like data, but greater democracy in tech.
Thank you. Just along here, the that lady at the end.
Hi, I'm Helen Milner. I'm the Chief Exec of Good Things Foundation. I'm really glad that the digital divide has come up, but there are 10 million people in the UK who lack the very, very basic digital skills, 1.5 million households who cannot afford even the most basic internet. I've been working hard on this a long time, nationally and internationally. I just want to know, why can't we fix the digital divide once and for all so we stop having to worry about it? The internet was supposed to be the great leveller, and it's absolutely not. So why can't we just fix it?
And just along here, the gentleman in the white shirt.
Thanks. Joshua Taggart from Atticus Partners. What are the main barriers to digitisation of public services? So we talked briefly about, there's been issues around inefficiencies in the NHS. I know the Home Office and the MOJ have also been similarly criticised. So what do the panel think are the main issues around digitising and making these services more efficient?
Right, so I'm aware Damian needs to shoot off in a minute. So Damian, I don't know if you want to tackle any of those questions.
Sure, do I get a choice? Okay.
You get a choice. Any or all 3.
Daniel spoke about this earlier on in terms of digitisation of public services. I think there's a job to be done to go across government and look. Certainly, if you look at the role that AI can play in analysing problems and providing solutions, is job to go across government and say, are there artificial barriers to that work being done? Are there rules and regulations that were really created for a pre-internet world that still apply and are actually holding back innovation? So that is, and there's one component of it. And the second thing is trust. So if you look at Estonia, great e-government program. At the heart of it is a really secure, very trusted digital ID system, which helps people access information. It's easy for people to see what public data relating to them is being shared and who with, and they can even deny access for some organisations to that data if they don't want them to have it. So I think thinking about, what are the artificial barriers to success that we can get rid of? What are the and how do we build trust for users along the way? Because public trust will help drive this. I think utility will as well. If people find that people may adopt digital solutions to problems if it makes it much easier to see a GP, but do it virtually, because obviously a consultant would do it virtually. So ease may drive that, but also I think trust is an important component part of that as well. And there are enormous opportunities. I mean, for kind of anecdotal example, a few years ago, a doctor's surgery that had 2 practices in my constituency closed one, and the patients were distributed to about 4 or 5 others. None of the GP practices had the same data system for storing patients' records. So patients' records in some cases were being printed out and then hand inputted back into a new system, so because they weren't compatible. So it's the kind of laborious job in a way, is going across the public sector, identifying where this is happening, and these are artificial barriers that are holding back innovation. This is not an answer to your question, but I think there is a really interesting question on data as to who owns it. People are creating data, some of which they regard as being theirs and as personally theirs, others which is data inferred from it, owned by tech companies they don't have access to, and may not have given their consent for it to be used in that way. So I think there is a job to be done as the world becomes more sophisticated in empowering people and businesses to understand what happens to the data they generate, how they can use it for themselves. I think I saw a couple of years ago. I was intrigued by this idea. I think Tim Berners-Lee's working on it, Inrupt in Boston, where the idea of you basically have your data pod that you sort of plug in places you go. It tells the interface you're plugging into who you are and what you're interested in, but you can also disconnect when you don't want to as well. So you kind of, rather than having a data system where basically everything about us is given away to massive companies that store all of it and design things on our behalf that do us good, is there a way you can create your digital pod and data and take it with you as you go around, which is, I think, an interesting idea. I mean, digital inclusion is hugely important. I spoke about it in the global context. I mean, I was recently at the conference for the International Telecommunications Union, where we were talking about their strategy around connecting the unconnected around the world. But as you rightly say, it applies at home as well. And so there has been some great schemes to try and help digital inclusion, but we still have to do more to close the divide. And as you say, it's not just about the quality of your broadband, it's also whether you have the equipment to be able to access it as well. I'm going to have to go, I'm afraid, but thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Damian. And just a round of applause. So, Daniel, I don't know if you wanted to come in anywhere on the digitalisation of public services.
I do. There's like a long list, right? The procurement systems have been built for a totally different era. The time that it takes for anybody to sell in means that the system privileges the large, cash-rich players and so on. So you can name a whole range of things. I want to focus on one thing that I think is contributing to all of these problems. And I think that is a lack of understanding of technology and its good and its bad inside the public sector. Now, I don't mean to say that there aren't people who know, how to build good product and so on, because over the last many years, there's been a real revolution, and you can go into most departments and find real technical specialists. The big challenge I think we have is most of the decisions are taken by policy officials who will take charge and run very large programs that contain in main, digital aspects or facilitated by technology, and they will have very little understanding of that technology, both for good and for bad. In a way that we would just not accept that a general would get their 4th star and not know anything about how weapons work, and we certainly wouldn't accept the permanent secretary and the treasury not knowing anything about economics. But we somehow accept that when it comes to technology. And I think one of the big pushes we need is an upskilling, a digital upskilling of the civil service, and I would argue also of politicians. Damian's gone, but an admonition more broadly, so that we can kind of address some of these other problems. So I would sort of hone in on that. If you had to rebuild the Harvard Kennedy School or Oxbridge or whatever, the PPE course at Oxbridge today, I think it has to be something that focuses on technology and government and public services, and I don't think we've quite done that yet. And quickly, if you will allow me, Helen, huge credit to you for the Good Things Foundation. The work that the foundation does, if you don't know it, please look it up, is really important. I wonder whether one of the ways we need to start thinking about this problem is slightly differently. We know roughly what it costs us to send somebody to university, what it costs society, right? We know roughly what it costs to send a child through school. We're happy to pay for that. We pay for that over university. It's partly subsidized, partly you pay for yourself. In schooling, we pay for it entirely over our taxation, general taxation. Now that we know that having access to devices is so facilitative and so critical, is it so crazy to think about a stipend that government, naturally has to pay? I don't know if it's means tested or not. I don't know how you, avoid fraud in the market. There are lots of ways to solve it. I sort of feel that we're coming at the problem accepting a bunch of parameters, and maybe we kind of just need to draw back a bit and say, well, if it's really so critical, do we need to think about it differently? A bit like the Danes have thought very differently about giving disadvantaged children access to pencils and paper when they go into schooling. I think I'm looking for some different way of thinking about this if we want to solve some of these divides.
Okay, and James, I don't know if you wanted to talk about digital divide. Why haven't we fixed it?
I was going to pick up actually on the democracy question, if that's all right, because it made me think of a conversation we had the other day as part of this project we're doing with JRF, which is called Social Justice in a Digital Age, but it's trying to ask some of the big questions about how the state needs to adapt. And I was really struck. There was someone made a really interesting point that because we're in such early days of the emergence of the digital economy, whatever we want to call it, the online world, and I think Rachel, you sort of touched on this point, is essentially privatized space. And so one thing that is very odd about this current moment is that over time, what you might expect to emerge is a much more mixed economy online, where you have some spaces that are public, and I think you mentioned data. So, for example, is data a public good, or are certain aspects of data a public good that should be governed in the public interest and held in trusts and so on? You might see emerge more kind of civic space online that is not run for profit, but is, whether it's run by charities or other sort of civic enterprises or even by governments. But certainly in the 19th century, in the early days of new technologies like the railways, there were sort of those early years where it was a kind of free-for-all, this sort of sense of a Wild West, everything was privatised, monopolies emerged. And then over time, we started to think, actually, we need a mixed economy here, some of which will be regulated, some will be private, some will be state-run. And that was kind of right and natural as a kind of way in which it matured. And I do think we will probably see that in terms of the online world, that we'll probably move beyond this current world where private entities like Facebook are making decisions that are very clearly should not be made by private companies, like regulating freedom of speech. It's just a complete category error. So I suspect we will see the emergence of democratic mechanisms, more civil society space, more public space online, and that's one of the big things that will happen in the next few decades.
Yes.
Just quickly make a point on the because I think it's really important in terms of how we're making sure that people are coming online now, and we use that to bridge the digital divide. I completely agree. I think that we've got to the point now where we should be looking for a government subsidy. I think that is now the kind of avenue that we need to go down, because we've got to such a point that in order for technology to be the great democratiser, we can't do that unless we are connected. Therefore, I think that is absolutely the route. And just the other point I just wanted to make is, I think we have to look at stopping doing this in silos, and I think Rachel touched on some of this point. This is now the point where we have to bring together those public and private partnerships, and we have to look at that bigger picture for that long-term goal, and we can't keep working in silos.
Rachel, so a broad range of questions and points there. Do you want to pick up on any?
So there's a couple of things, and I can give a plug to a very optimistic bit of work I've been trying to do for a while, which is working with a health funder trying to roll out either free or radically affordable broadband in a housing estate in South London. Because what's really apparent in like this urban context is there's loads of internet, there's loads of connectivity everywhere. It's just gated, you know, and that if you walk over the road from this estate, it's easier to get at. And I think we really do need to stop thinking of connectivity particularly as being only a market problem, and to start thinking about kind of really big infrastructural ways of doing it differently. And that in a way there's a lot we don't really know, right, about how when you give people who maybe have to go and hang out outside McDonald's or in the library access to the internet on their own terms, what actually happens, right? You know, there's a huge opportunity there, which I think we ought to be investing in. And I think, you know, the other thing about maybe, I would say, from a community and a cooperative perspective, I'm going to plug another thing I'm working on, which is about funding community-based organisations in the UK to make their own technologies. And I think we really need to get beyond the idea that data is owned, right? Because actually the value that it has depends on context. And I think a good governance, like really kind of genuinely adaptive long-term governance, is not about who owns it, who can extract the value, but about developing kind of proper commons and different ways of thinking about public goods. And so I really hope we're about to, next week, we're announcing a fund which will support 10 community organisations over 2 years in maintaining and developing their infrastructure. And like, I really hope that those kinds of experiments start to sort of surface other ways of doing it.
Thank you, Rachel. And yes, great to hear some experiments going on. Just to provide some concrete examples of some of the innovations Daniel's been talking about. So, Jasper, I mean, lots of lines of inquiry here. I mean, I don't know if there's any you want to.
The one that the democratisation of data is obviously really interesting in terms of ownership of data, or not saying ownership, but governance is fundamentally important, and it's not. There's the positive side of, you know, how can that help me, how can that benefit me, how that can benefit my community, but there's also the fact we need to reform that, because the way in which our data is currently used is absolutely terrifying. You know, it is the thing that drives the online advertising industry, and we have a problem that if we start giving less data to those companies, they might need to find other ways to, or justify their huge profits. And the advertising industry also funds a lot of very bad stuff, again, built on this sort of data system. You also just have basically, you know, Russia has access to huge amounts of data about us. China has access to huge amounts of data from us. It's a very opaque industry. There will be data about everyone in this room. There will be personal data that you don't like, almost certainly in the hands of a company that has a direct relationship or an indirect relationship with Chinese state organisations. I mean, if you look at the industry, it is one of the murkiest you've ever seen. And so actual good governance of this is incredibly important. The thing you need to do that is also education, because most people don't understand. I've been writing about the advertising data industry for a decade, and I don't understand it. You talk to people who work in the industry and they don't really understand it. There is almost no one who understands it, and normal people just don't have a fucking chance. Sorry, excuse the swearing. So we need to teach people about it, because it's going to be a vital part of their lives going forward, and that's something, again, that you need to actually have digital divide and have education really effectively.
Can I just say something on that, which is I've been, and those of you who have older kids than I do may know better, but I've been actually quite impressed by how much schools are now thinking about it, whether or not they're actually delivering training in the way that we would ideally like. It's clear that the educational establishment is, you know, grappling with how to do it. At the same time, you know, I'm shocked to find all the things that my son knows about TikTok, even though he's banned from it, has no app, has no phone or anything like that. So, but just to say, it just feels like there's a real willingness and a desire, even if out of fear, by the educational establishment to get into this.
And that's a first step. We also basically need to make the companies actually be more transparent about it, and you need to ensure that also government, when it's talking to people, talks about how the data is being used in a really transparent and sort of accessible way, which is just something that the services themselves do not do because they have a vested interest in not really having us think about it very often.
Yes, I mean, I think we can all agree transparency is quite the issue with some of the big tech and big companies, platforms that we're talking about. But yes, encouraging to see that there's already signs of progress, as you say, kind of in the educational system. So I think we're ready to open the floor up to another round of questions. If anyone wants to ask the panel anything. Max, just...
Hi, I'm Max from Bright Blue. I'm going to take an opportunity to ask a question. We ran the event. I think I should ask a question. I've been in and out of the room, so I'm not sure if this has been answered at all. But I know gaming was brought up for a little bit, and there's a real problem with gambling mechanics stuck in video games at the moment. And recently DCMS said they're not going to do anything about it, and they're just going to kind of let it slide, which isn't really great, especially when the online safety bill we're hoping will try and deal with some of these issues. So does the panel kind of have any thoughts on, are just DCMS completely wrong, or whether or not they actually think that what the approach they've taken is right, and what could possibly be done to tackle this issue?
Thank you, Max. And do we have any further questions? Yes, just here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Linda from Kids Count. The gentleman behind me has already alluded to part of what I was wanting to say, is that we've let the genie out of the bottle, and it's a wonderful place to be. But my concern is that we're rushing headlong into something really that's an abyss, and we don't really know what we're dealing with. And so I'm not saying that we go backwards, because we don't need to, but I think we need to be very cautious about what areas of our lives we're opening up, because at the moment, and it's very clear even from the great brains in this room, that we don't actually have the ability to be able to manage where we are today. And if we're going to put things like the MOJ and other things out online, I think we have a significant issue. If you consider young people, bullying, internet crime, dating crime, stalking. I've been a victim of stalking. And believe you me, when you've been a victim of stalking, you realise that actually these people come into your home. They come in through the TV, through your computers, through any which way. And it's actually almost impossible to stop. And all I'm saying is that it's very important that we go forward, because it is a huge market and it's a great world. And I'm not into huge regulation, but I'd like to have some confidence that actually we really know what we're dealing with before we move further into that abyss.
And just at the back, yeah.
Hi there, Shomik Panda from Inline Policy. The Minister touched upon the challenges around harmful and illegal content. How would the panel treat harmful content differently from illegal?
So, Susie, do you want to come in on any of those?
Well, I think...
Could you answer all of them, because they're quite complex?
Let me just break that down. No, I think touching very seriously on the online safety bill and that area. I'm probably not going to say anything groundbreaking to anyone in this room, but I think from TalkTalk's point of view, we were early on, as many of the ISPs were, about regulation and self-regulation in terms of the filters that we put into the networks, and we make sure that they're still there for parental controls and so on. But it has now got to the point where big tech hasn't stepped up to the plate. It needs to, and I think all I can really say is that I think the era of self-regulation is over, and it is time for big tech to be held accountable, and I think that has to come in through legislation.
Jasper.
I mean, the harmful question is really interesting. I mean, I have spent, as I said, quite a long time recently writing about harmful content that isn't illegal on the internet. And saying vaccines are going to microchip you and you're going to be controlled by Bill Gates is not illegal at all. It's just crazy. I actually don't think that harmful content should be often legislated for against. I'm really, really wary of that because I'm also a journalist, and I think there is a slippery slope massively when you have government legislating against things that are effectively not illegal online because they're somehow different. I think the key thing that actually government does need to do in terms of holding big tech to account is it needs to address the incentive structures within those platforms that encourage people to spread misinformation, for instance, or spread hate. Quite a lot of the time, actually, you'll find within these organisations that yes, people are crazed anti-vaxxers or people who have some sort of hatred of a specific ethnic group. Quite a lot of the time, they're also making money, and they're making money in these platforms through ways in which these platforms facilitate that. And that's one very clear way you would actually cut a lot of this information out, the misinformation and other harmful content out, is by reducing those incentives. There are also incentives in the way the platforms are built to make money for the platforms themselves that encourage that kind of behaviour, encourage engagement seeking, which is one of the key drivers behind this. And I think those are the sort of target areas that governments need to really address. It is not as simple as just seeing the algorithm, which is a phrase that we constantly hear, or legislating on algorithms. It's much more complex than that. There isn't one algorithm. But you need to get to the incentive structures behind it much more than going after individual pieces of content because A, you're not going to actually succeed at that, and B, it starts to lead you into very dangerous places. In terms of the broader issue of whether we're going too fast, I think I would worry probably slightly more about the private companies than the MOJ putting its systems online, for instance. I think the MOJ is probably something that needs to accelerate its digitalisation, if anything. I am concerned about these things, but as you say, the genie is very much out of the bag, and we just need to build up our resilience to it much more quickly. I also think some of the concerns about children students, this is slightly overblown. I do think children often are very good at navigating these things. We need to support them while also tackling people who will try and exploit them. And in terms of the gambling sort of systems within games, loot boxes is the classic one. I think, again, it's the kind of thing you're looking at incentive structures on the internet that can be deeply damaging, and I don't see why those would be treated any differently to gambling as a broader
stalking.
as a
I
broader
think she's
thing.
talking about.
Stalking's illegal. It's already illegal if you do it online. It's difficult to prosecute, but that's an issue to do with the policing system. It's not necessarily one to do with legislation.
Yeah, I just want to make just add a dimension because there's a tendency when it comes to the conversation about the harm that particularly the technology companies create to think that this is only about large companies and all the platforms that we're familiar with. But the reality is that there are lots and lots of smaller games, smaller platforms, smaller social networks that you may be part of or you may never have heard of, which may not have 10 billion users, but maybe only have 300,000. And they certainly struggle in a different way than some of the large companies because they often haven't thought any of these questions through as they've gone on a particular, could have been a very rapid journey to scale. They don't have as much resource available to them in order to introduce some of the safeguards. And in that regard, I'm very pleased to see a lot of the work that DCMS has encouraged in the creation of new technologies or more affordable technologies for that kind of middle layer where it's not a question of, you've got to do it yourself. You can expect that of, Facebook or Meta. So it's just simply to say that there's a sort of differentiated market out there, and some of them in the market, don't really have the financial or even engineering wherewithal to solve some of the problems they themselves have created. How to engage with that market is, I think, one of the key issues because there are lots of kids who are playing on games that aren't being run by Meta, and so it's just let's not forget that segment of the market.
Rachel, do you have any thoughts on some of these issues?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I would say to some of the smaller companies actually is that is an area where regulators are able to be extremely helpful in a way that maybe is a bit more difficult with the larger companies who have quite significant policy machines of their own. And that actually, in a way, I would say one of the things that has held us up in the long journey to getting the online safety bill through is we're trying to use one instrument to do a lot of different things, and as has been brought up, harms emerge constantly, right? And that actually, if we try and enumerate all the problems that we're aware of and make a system that works for those, well, we're never going to have a bill, right? We're always going to be held up on the logic of that, right? And that really what we need to be thinking about is, rather than online is a thing, it's in all things, you know, and that we could be looking at updating other kinds of legislation that we have to include the internet, rather than bundling it all into one thing. And I think in terms of things like loot boxes, for instance, what happens is that it becomes, you know, in terms of all the things about the child the safety in particular, it becomes extremely heightened, and it becomes the case of the policy people at the corporate companies making cases against the activists and campaigners. And really, we could just be more honest about it, right? We could say, we know this is bad. And I think that it's one of the things that comes of having, in a way, the business policy in the same department as the safety policies. You know, they need to be uncoupled, and we need to think about it across the whole of government. You know, and I think it is often as well really, really hard to, as an individual, cope with a harm that has been inflicted on you through a diffuse network. And it's very hard to get help. And in previous work I've done, one of the things I've campaigned on is the idea that we should have a regulatory front door. So as an individual, if you have an issue, rather than working out who it is in the big world of either justice or regulators to go to, there ought to be maybe an ombudsman that we can turn to say, I have a problem, can you help? And that a system ought to pick it up. And so I don't think any of these things are possible, but we're making it hard because we're trying to, what's the phrase, like eat the elephant, right? And it could be much easier, I think.
And finally, James, do you want to come in on some of those three questions?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of harder than it even seems. I think that the two questions about harm and illegal, harm versus illegal, harmful versus illegal, and the question about gambling, both I think come to the same point, which you I think touched on, Jasper, of incentives, because it's really the business model. That is the root issue, is that the incentive is to create ever more compulsive experiences, whether it's for kids or us as we're doom scrolling. And it's bloody hard as an individual, as Rachel said, it's very hard as an individual within a sort of system that is designed to create those compulsive or addictive experiences. It's hard to act as an individual within that, and you need to act at a system-wide level, and somehow we need to act on the incentive, because whilst we're in this kind of, I guess, old regulatory mindset of sort of saying, here's all the bad stuff we don't like and let's ban that stuff, or here's the content that crosses that line from harmful into illegal and let's ban that content, we're not really addressing that underlying issue that there is a massively strong economic incentive, and there will be, because that's now the world we're in, to create these harmfully addictive and compulsive experiences. And one way they do that is by spreading content that is untrue or dangerous or incendiary or whatever it might be. And that's a really big deal. So sorry to end on a slightly gloomy kind of point, but it's kind of, until we get to the nub of it, I think we're kind of not going to make real progress.
Yeah, so ending on a moderately gloomy note there, but I think overall, I think we've heard recognition that this is a challenge on a historical scale, really, and to some extent we're going to need a paradigm shift in some aspects, in terms of public services, in terms of the way we the way we regulate existing markets, create your functioning new markets even. And yeah, we've heard some differing perspectives as well on how we tackle that. Some different views on particularly data ownership. But lots of optimism and lots of reasons to be cheerful. Lots of potential innovations and things that we can still try. So just to wrap up, I'd like to thank the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for partnering with us for this event, making it possible, and to once again thank all of our panelists for speaking. So obviously, you're welcome to stay in the room for a while to mingle. Our next event is at 4:30 in this room. If you're interested in becoming a member of Bright Blue, you can speak to one of our team at the back. Max, if you want to ask him about membership, maybe get into a debate with him about loot boxes and gambling. But just to let you know, we do have an exclusive discounted offer of £10 on our membership if you join during party conference. So I mentioned our next event is at 4:30 in this room, but we have all in all 32 events that we've been doing at party conference. So there's many more to come today and tomorrow. So hopefully we'll see you at some of them. But once again, big round of applause for all of our panelists.